Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining our weekly live stream regarding digital transformation. This is a live recording of our Transformation Ground Control podcast. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and I'm also the host of this podcast, Transformation Ground Control. So thank you for being here today. Today's topic is digital transformation is dead, and it never really existed. So we're really trying to poke the bear here and stir up some discussion as it relates to the current state and the future state of digital transformation. I'm going to introduce our guest here in just a moment, but before I do, a couple logistical things. First of all, as I mentioned, this is a weekly live stream we do every week as part of our Transformation Ground Control podcast. It will become edited, polished, and added to other content and made into an episode of that podcast that gets released a week from tomorrow. So Wednesday of next week, that podcast is released every Wednesday on audio podcast platforms, as well as on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. So be sure to check out that podcast if you don't already. And thank you for being here for the live production of the podcast here today. We are going to get to audience questions today. So we are going to start with some of the questions I have about digital transformation, why it's dead, why it never existed, and the way we should sort of reframe or rethink a digital transformation in order to be successful. And I'll introduce our guest here in just a moment and again, get into some of my questions, but I encourage the audience to ask questions. That's really what the show is all about, is trying to get audience participation and questions. So please feel free to drop any questions you have for my guest and I here in the chat, and we'll get to those here today. And also, speaking of the chat, if you don't mind dropping in the chat where you're from today, what city and country are you joining from? It's always interesting to see where in the world our global community is joining from here today. So if you don't mind, just drop in the chat, what city and country are you joining from? And I'm excited for our guest, a first-time guest on this show. He's a client of Third Stages, and very cool industry, cool company. I'm going to let him explain it all better than I ever could. But it's Drake Coker, who is the CEO of Nashville Record Pressing, which is a client of ours. Drake, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Eric. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. And this is going to be an exciting conversation. You and I have had some interesting conversations leading up to this one about this particular topic, and I'm excited to unpack it and see what the audience thinks too, and get some of the input from the audience here. But before I do that, maybe tell us a little bit about you yourself, and also about Nashville Record Pressing and what you guys do.
Yeah. Okay. I've been at entrepreneurialism for a long time. So I've been involved in a number of companies early on, and then through sort of the duration of their life, and also have had a stint working for some very large companies as a consultant. So I've seen a lot of things, but I've always really been drawn to doing things that are physical, doing things that actually exist in the world, right? I had a vinyl record related startup in Los Angeles for about 7 years. And in the midst of that, got to know a number of the players in the industry. The biggest of which is a company based in the Czech Republic called GZ Media, which already has a couple of pressing plants here in North America, Precision Record Pressing in Toronto, as well as Memphis Record Pressing in Memphis, Tennessee. And about 2.5 years ago, they had a need to build a new plant in Nashville. They called me up and asked me if I would move to Nashville and build and run the new business for them. And I said yes. And so here we are.
Interesting. So you've got that entrepreneurial background. You've obviously have the experience in the background in vinyl record production, but tell us about Nashville Record Pressing and what you guys do, and sort of what's the state of not the state of the market, but what's your role in the market? Let's start there.
Yeah, well, it's pretty cool. So with our parent in the Czech Republic, GZ, and our sister companies here in North America, Precision, and Memphis, there's quite a bit of independence between the businesses, but we run a rather tightly organized and orchestrated group. The group's largest customers are the major record labels and other very large producers of vinyl records. And our customers over the last couple of years had been asking for more and more capacity. Vinyl record capacity globally had been rather constrained. There hadn't been much investment in the business, particularly in North America, since the early '70s. And it's not the easiest thing to do to bring new vinyl record pressing capacity online, because it's based around these very particular pieces of equipment called vinyl record presses, which are very difficult to get. No one was producing them. And our parent very very intelligently started producing their own about 10 years ago. And so we sort of had a big jump in this upswing that we've seen in the market. And so it was clear that our customers not only needed more capacity, but they wanted that capacity located in Nashville. They specifically asked us to build a pressing plant here. The original concept, I think the original idea was very cool, but also fairly small, fairly humble. And then over the course of sort of digging into it a little bit, the need and the aspirations grew rather quickly. So I got involved in May of 2021, moved to Nashville. I was the first here. I had boots in the ground on August 1. And at that point, it took us the rest of the year to sort of find and lease a building, get some building permits submitted, and get going. We had building permits in hand by January 15 of 2022. We had contractors in place on March 1 of 2022, and that's sort of when the project started in haste. At that point, we had a 100,000 square foot building, which was totally empty, just concrete and columns. And it's been a whirlwind since. So by June 22nd of 2022, we were making our first records. By October 17th, we made our 1 millionth record. December of last year, we made 1 million records alone. And, and it basically grown from just a few people working with me to a team of over 200, running 5 days a week, 24 hours a day, producing 60,000 records in a 24-hour time period. And then this year, in the process of doubling that capacity again, while bringing an ERP system online, which is obviously how we got involved, and executing a number of additional, rather complex, multifaceted projects simultaneously to get the company where we want it to be in a very short period of time.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really cool. So total startup mode to scale up mode to sort of just ramping up production. That's got to be an exciting journey in a pretty short period of time. Hearing you describe these volumes that you're already doing in a short period of time makes some wonder. I think there might be some listening right now that wonder, well, how could you possibly be making that many records? With all the digital media alternatives in the marketplace with Apple Music and Spotify and Amazon Music, why in the world would I buy records? Maybe tell us a little bit about the state of the industry, because it's making somewhat of a comeback here. It's cool again to buy vinyl and to have vinyl, but what is it about vinyl that's getting this resurgence, and what does the future hold, or what do you think the future market looks like for the vinyl industry?
Yeah, so our view on this is a bit different than others. Clearly we're seeing a tremendous resurgence in vinyl. We're about 10 years into it now, actually, something like that, maybe a little bit more. But it's picked up a lot of momentum in the last 4 or 5 years. People are sort of calling it the vinyl revival. But I think there's just a short bit of historical perspective is helpful. I think everyone's been rather surprised that vinyl records have sort of come back, right? And are asking the exact questions that you're asking. But the truth is, this is not the first time that vinyl's come back. It's the third time. It was challenged both by AM radio early in the 20th century, and then by stereo magnetic tape in the middle of the 20th century, and then again by CDs and the progression to peer sharing, and then iTunes and sort of digital downloads, and then streaming, right? So the truth is that historically speaking, vinyl is the only format, to survive the technologies that have succeeded it. And it's done it 3 times over 100 years. So we can, for another, for another live stream around another topic, we can talk about why that is. But people just really like vinyl. And what's happening now is that a new generation is sort of rediscovering it. And it's funny, it's like they're rediscovering it for the first time, or rediscovering something that's really existed for a long time. So I think from our standpoint, when we went digital, I think everyone just assumed that digital music was going to be just a different delivery vehicle. It was just going to be a different distribution channel for the same product. But what I think in fact has happened is that it bifurcated the market. And digital's amazing. It's inexpensive. It's totally portable. You get everything. It becomes a very social experience if you're involved. It's easy to listen to what your friends are listening to, or what you're, seeing online or in a stream or something like that. But it's also very passive, right? It's in fact, what we see is that digital music consumption is a lot like consuming an IG feed, or a LinkedIn feed, or a Facebook feed, right? You just kind of fall through it and evolve over time. And that's great for a lot of people. And digital is terrific. I mean, it's doing things through the industry that were never before possible, which is rather exciting. And there is a not insignificant number of people who crave a much more active relationship with their music. And those people tend to want to be able to own their music. They love the physical experience, and that's really where vinyl shines.
Right.
And I think the proof is in what we've seen in sales. And and the official sales numbers are significantly understated. But right now we're at a place where across the group, we're producing well over 300,000 records a day and on our way to 500,000. So it doesn't take much math to sort of figure out, what that looks like globally. There are lots of other players out there. We're certainly not the only game in town. We are a significant player, but there is an awful lot of people that are buying and collecting vinyl records.
Yeah. I think it's a fascinating industry. Partly, I mean, I love music, as you and I have discussed, and I, so much so that I named this company Third Stage Consulting after rock and roll and after a rock and roll album. But I love vinyl. I think there's something to be said for the physical experience, as you described, just the look and feel of the vinyl, the liner notes, the sound quality is so much better. And, digital might be it might be more convenient, but it doesn't sound as good. It's more compressed. It just doesn't have the depth and the warmth that a vinyl recording or a vinyl listening experience has. So I can see why people are gaining a renewed appreciation for vinyl. It's really interesting to hear your take on how the industry has survived multiple, evolutions and competitive threats dating back to AM radio. That's fascinating. I'd never really thought of it from that perspective. So I have to ask you a question then, being that you're an entrepreneur, you're in this space, you're the CEO of a company that produces vinyl records. What are some of your favorite records, or your favorite music in general, whether it's on vinyl or not?
Yeah, I think a lot of people that are in the business say that they have rather eclectic tastes, and I actually do. So there's I'm a huge fan of a lot of the music that's coming out of the UK, particularly in the 80s and 90s. There's a lot of stuff that we would call rock and roll that I'm really into. I was in Los Angeles for 20 years. I got very connected to the indie music scene there. There's a lot of stuff. I was in college when grunge was unfolding. So it just kind of I had parents that and a grandfather that listened to a lot of jazz and classical. But it kind of it changes day to day what I'm listening to. But what's cool, I think, is the relationship that that I have with the music that I love. And it's funny, that's where kind of the records are the coolest, because oftentimes I listen to a record and it reminds me of the person that turned me on to the record, or occasions where I used to listen to that record, or how many times I've moved that record from one house to another, or one city to another, or where it came from. And that's, to me, I think the piece that's the keeps me plugged in. Like it's got a lot of hooks in me, and there isn't as much of that. In my experience, that's harder and harder to find these days. So
Right.
it's a pretty cool thing.
That's very cool. And it's cool to be able to lead a company that fits your passion too, and your love of music and the entrepreneurial spirit that you have as well.
Yeah.
Well, very cool. So let's talk about this topic here that I think this was your idea, actually. The words digital transformation is dead, I think is your idea. And I love it because it's controversial. I think it makes you wonder, well, what in the world do you mean digital transformation is dead? And that's what we're going to get into. But I also like it too, because it's sort of a riff on the rock and roll, rock is dead quote from the Doors or the Who, insert rock band that quoted that phrase here. Long live rock, rock is dead, long live rock, that whole controversy that's been going on for decades sort of fits in here at digital transformation. Is digital transformation dead? I'd be curious to hear from the audience. Do you think digital transformation is dead? Do you think the way we've been doing it is sustainable? Is it the right way? Is there something else that's on the horizon? I'd love to hear kind of the audience feedback here. And before I ask you maybe to describe what you think around this whole thread of digital transformation being dead, Drake, I want to turn to the audience real quick and just recognize where some of the people are joining from today. We have people joining from all over the world, as I mentioned earlier. Los Angeles, your old stomping ground, Drake. We have someone from Los Angeles, Denver, Colorado, Pakistan, India, Denver, Colorado again, UK, Vietnam, Naperville, Illinois, Ethiopia, India, Egypt, Doha, Dubai, Dallas, Texas. A lot of global participation here today. So thank you everyone for joining and being part of this digital transformation community here today. And if you have any questions for Drake as we get going here, I'd love to hear your comments. And I'd also love to hear comments about, is digital transformation dead? And for that matter, is rock dead? Is vinyl dead? I don't know. There's a lot of questions we have here, a lot of unanswered questions. But maybe just to get started on this whole thread then, Drake, your vision for Nashville Record Pressing is to be more than a record pressing company. Tell us a little bit about the longer term vision of the company and what is it you're trying to build? And you and I have talked a bit about this in, our client related work, our client and consulting relationship, but tell us a little bit about the vision of the company and what is it you're trying to do and what is it you're trying to build?
Yeah. So let me see if I can do this rather briefly. Frankly, the goal for NRP is to be the best record pressing plant in the world, and perhaps the best record pressing plant that's ever existed in the world. Inside of this group that we're very fortunate to be part of, and in service of the group's success. Part of this is about this unusual set of sort of causes and conditions that existed around how this company has been created and how we've been able to grow it. And then part of it's about sort of what's going on specifically around vinyl and in the world. And then some of it's also about sort of what's going on in the world in terms of technology and even digital transformation. And so putting those things very quickly together, we are absolutely a startup, but we are a startup that has been unbelievably blessed from the beginning with capital support. We're in a situation where we have literally years of runway in front of us, where every record that we produce is already pre-sold and wrapped up inside of capacity agreements that we have across the group with our larger customer. We have all kinds of operational and technological support. We have access to vinyl record presses, which is a very rare thing. And so we've had this confluence of events where, yes, we're starting this thing from scratch, and obviously everything that we do has to be built, but we get to literally stand on the shoulders of our group and sort of everything that's come before. So it's like we're getting catapulted forward, and it's really, I think, our obligation to take tremendous advantage of those resources and momentum, and to try to maintain our vision and our balance and make the most out of it, just to leapfrog as far into the future as we can. Right. That's sort of what's going on with us. What's going on inside of music and vinyl is that there's a tremendous amount of love for it. This revival has been demand driven. It's been pulled by the marketplace, right? And the industry really got out of the business of making records. And making records is hard. It's complicated. It's hard. It has quite a bit more engineering and technicality in it than I think most people recognize, and a lot of art, right? And so being able to, it's difficult to bring records to market, and it's difficult particularly to bring more and more titles to market. So a second piece of this vision is how we can not only be really just good at the basic functions, but how we as a company and as a group can provide more and more services to our customers to help get more and more titles into the marketplace, and provide, access to the people that love and buy and collect vinyl to a much broader swath of the catalog, and in so doing, hopefully continue to reignite and refuel their love for vinyl, and then continue to drive the market forward as a whole. But the third piece of this is just we're living in an incredibly transformational time in my view, and I think that it challenges me personally and professionally, and it challenges an awful lot of people that I have a tremendous amount of respect for, to really accurately gauge how much change is in the works right now broadly. And I think that if you can look it squarely in the face, there's an opportunity, and probably in my situation, a responsibility to ask some big questions, which is not only how far can we go, but more importantly, in what direction do we want to go, and what are we actually trying to create, right? And how can technology and this change be a tool that helps bring more intentionality, and I would say human-centered vision to what we're building, rather than just trying to hang on for dear life and see where we end up, right? And so you put those three things together. Some of that's very tactical, some of it's very strategic, some of it's very sort of long term. But it's a combination of those, and a confluence of those particular conditions and situations that we're using to shape and drive the vision around what we're doing with NRP.
Very cool. Yeah, it's exciting to think about, and it's a pretty innovative way to think about building a company, and especially in an industry that's as fast changing as vinyl, because in some ways vinyl, the technology or the product hasn't changed a ton, at least the way I see it. I could be wrong, but it doesn't seem like the product itself has changed that much over decades. But the industry has gone through a tremendous amount of change, as you mentioned, the beginning with AM radio and peer sharing and CDs and digital delivery of music, just a lot of disruption to the industry in general. How do you see digital transformation? I'm going to use that term pretty loosely, but the term digital transformation, how do you see that concept enabling the vision that you just described in those three different pillars of your strategy?
Well, I think for us, what we're trying to do is stay very involved with what's going on day to day and inside our business. And I said, we've just launched a new ERP system. It was something that we've wanted from the beginning. Our parent has been running an ERP system for about 18 years. They have highly customized it and augmented to it over time, right? And so what we're getting is a rather well vetted implementation that's taken quite a bit of work to retool for what we're doing here in Nashville, which in terms of the nuts and bolts of the business is fairly different than what's happening with our parent in the Czech Republic, right? And so we're discovering the system, we're learning what it does, we're learning what it doesn't do, we're learning what we like and what we don't like. And this is a very like in the weeds, moment to moment, day to day activity, right? But it would be easy for us to just sort of stay on that path, become more and more connected to that ERP system, upgrade it to kind of the current version that is out there, and figure out how to pull in all these changes that have been made, and just kind of ride that train, just sort of ride that train without much thought, right? And so the question that we've been asking is like, wait a second, where is this train actually leading, right? And how does this train compare to the other trains, planes, and automobiles that are available to us, particularly in a time when technology is changing in such a fundamental way, right? And how do we extract as much advantage and as much benefit and as much value as we can out of what we've got, right? But how do we create a real vision about where we want to go, which I think is about, at least really practically, is creating a bit of distance from what we are managing day to day, and really, this is kind of a terrible analogy, but trying to work from a clean sheet of paper as much as possible and say, okay, what do we want this company to be? What do we want this company to be in 10 years, in 20 years, in 50 years? What role do we want it to play? What role do we want to play to our customers? What role do we want it to play to our community? What role do we want it to play to vinyl, right? And music, and really, what role do we want it to play in the lives of the people that are investing really their lives in helping to build it, right? And for me, I think what's been amazing about this experience is sort of is how these things have come together to create the opportunities that we're facing. We're very, very fortunate as a company. These things just don't always come together. And, we are never going to be a company that employs 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 people. We're not going to be a company that, is trading on 4 continents. There's going to be some limits. So I think that there's this sense like, okay, how do we grow this thing, and how do we grow it into something that's really a powerful source of support for all the people that we're connected to, right? And what does that really look like? And then working backwards from there. And I mean this even in specific ways, like saying, okay, in 5 years from now, we expect to be seeing X amount of revenue run through this company, and we would like to run this company with a leadership team of this size. And we would like the roles of the leadership team in terms of responsibility and content, but also balance, to look like this. How do we then put the technology underneath it to be able to actually bring that reality to life, right? So that we get something that's designed around people that are taking care of it every day, rather than the other way around, right? And I think that that's oftentimes where things break down. Where in my experience, it's easy to lose the forest for the trees.
Right. Yeah, and it's almost like, from hearing you describe it here today and in past conversations I've had with you, technology is just an enabler for sort of this bigger vision and this bigger strategy that you're trying to enable. And you talk a lot, hearing you talk now and in the past about this topic, you talk a lot about people and the people side of things and innovation and the culture you're trying to create. It's a lot of, I don't hear you getting into a lot of techno speak as we talk about digital transformation, which is why I find this conversation fascinating. And I think that's why you're so successfully focused on the right things in the world of digital transformation, and in particular, the ERP implementation that we just helped you with and that you just went through as a company, and some of the other digital initiatives you might do in the future as well. There's a couple interesting comments here from the audience I want to get to before we get too far into this. So one comment here is from Kyler on LinkedIn, who says digital transformation is not dead. It's just often misunderstood. And I think that might be kind of where you're going. You didn't use those exact words, but the way you describe digital transformation is different than a technology initiative. And too often, I think organizations think of digital transformation as a technology initiative. And the word digital is a little misleading, because it's really not about the digital piece of it. It's about the transformation, which is the people and process side of things as well. There's an interesting comment related to the music industry and vinyl and delivery mechanisms for music. We certainly haven't seen a resurgence of cassette tapes. Is that true? I mean, I don't think cassette tapes have really had the same appeal as vinyl. There's something about vinyl that stands the test of time in the different iterations it's been through, as you described.
Yeah, cassettes have made a little comeback, but it's a very cottagey thing. It's very local. kind of alive in a few music scenes across the country. But you know, I and I don't. I mean, obviously, I say this tongue in cheek, but like, you know, if you compare vinyl to CDs, and you know, you sort of say what's going on. I mean, at the end of the day, we'll see what happens. But you know, CDs are office supplies, and vinyl is art. You know, and cassette tapes were
Right.
something that we used to put in answering machines. It's not. There.
Right.
You know, it's just the form matters because our relationship to the product matters. And by the way, I think that that's something that in terms of like, you know, digital transportation not being dead, just misunderstood. I totally agree with that. I mean, I think that the reality is that in my experience, it's how I relate to things and how the teams I lead relate to things and how as an organization that we relate to things that gives those things either um, appropriate or inappropriate power in our day-to-day life trying to run the business, right? So digital transformation is really what we make it, but I think it takes it's not something that can live in its own. That we approach it a particular way. We build teams to try to bring it to life. Those teams have a point of view. They have a perspective. They certainly have bias because of what they've done in the past, you know, in terms of how to drive this thing. And then oftentimes, if you're not intentional about where you're going and how you want to relate to something, then you get an unintentional relationship to it, which oftentimes leads to unintentional consequences. I think it's amazing that we're living in a time where sort of there's never been more opportunity or possibility in terms of what technology can do for us, or more risk. And most people, most of the time, are really disconnected from sort of that truth and sort of how broad that spectrum is, and making choices about how to sort of um, you know, think about and interrelate with what's going on. You know, I mean, it's highly likely. I have two young girls, but you know, they're it's not that far in the future when they're going to be thinking about driving. And the way that we're going now, it is. I think that there's certainly a better than 0% chance that there'll be no need for them to have driver's license, because you know, autonomous vehicles will be available to hail on any smartphone in, you know, very cost effective and reasonable ways, right? That's a
Right.
little nuts to think that this is, you know, not 20 or 30 or 40 years away. We could argue about how far away it is, but it's not 20 years away, right?
Right. Yeah, we're seeing the early signs of it with Tesla and other pioneers in the space for sure. Some other comments here. This is from Cyber Veteran on YouTube, says digital transformation is going through a cooling off period. So it's not dead, it's cooling off. Um, I think that's an interesting take on it. And then this is from Will on LinkedIn. Will says digital transformation is not dead. Most are not experts on the topic and struggle to form a plan, then execute it properly. It's like AI, or artificial intelligence. Many are intrigued and wish to use it, but few know how to get it started. So I think that's an interesting point. There's a lot of interest in digital transformation. A lot of organizations want to do it, but there's sort of a lack of expertise and experience of having been through, you know, a modern transformation like that. And then here's I never thought we'd do a digital transformation live stream and get into social distortion, but it's happening. It's happening as we speak here. Clay on LinkedIn says Mike Ness talks about going back to wire guitar versus wireless, and Mike Ness is the guitar player for a band called Social Distortion. Speaking of, they're from the UK, aren't they? Are they a UK band? Um, but I just assume because they're punk, they must be. But anyway, he talks about going back to wire guitar versus wireless in the pursuit of tone, specifically saying why take the tone and run it through an iPhone, then to a speaker. So I think there's a lot of musical purists out there. They're sort of supporting this vinyl movement and the purity of the sound of vinyl. And so I think that's it makes for an interesting future for sure. But I wanted to maybe get to a question here of, you know, how do you, if digital transformation is dead, which there's some controversy over whether or not it is. I mean, some are saying it's not dead, it's misunderstood, it's just cooling off. We don't know how to do it right. You know, there's a lot of different reasons or justifications for why it may not be dead, but there's something wrong with digital transformation as we know it. So if it's dead, then how is this initiative that you're going through at NRP how is that different from traditional digital transformation? So how would you contrast what you guys are doing with what other organizations might tend to do with their digital initiatives?
Yeah. So as I'd mentioned before, our situation is rather unique, right? And there's obviously some comments that have been made, I think, very appropriately, that each organization and each situation is unique, and I don't think that that's to be underestimated. We are, as this company is growing, it's certainly been a lot to manage, right? The pace of things. But we also got to start with a blank slate, right? So we're not in a situation where, we are 20 or 40 or 80 years old, and have, facilities spread out across 8 states, and are invested in an ERP system, or other systems, where we're trying to either uh, upgrade and reinvent and shift what we have, um, uh, or bring something new online, right? And so I'm clear that we work rather hard. I certainly work rather hard to try to keep us very intentionally minded, very very focused on what we're doing. But we're also unbelievably fortunate that we're in the situation where we're able to do that, right? Because clearly tearing things completely out, that have become sort of a digital backbone of an organization, even if they're largely unaffected, even if they can be rather ineffective in lots of ways, is a very, very difficult process, right? I'm not underestimating that. But
Right.
I think about Los Angeles, where I just moved from, is a good example. So most people don't know that early in the last century, Los Angeles had the most sophisticated subway system in the world. It was called the Red Car. And there was both above ground and a subterranean rail. And basically, the guy who is largely responsible for having Los Angeles end up being laid out the way it was laid out was had had been in railroad for a long time and moved to Los Angeles, when there were only 100,000 people between Tijuana and Valencia, and predicted that in 10 years there'd be 1 million people living there, and everybody thought he was crazy. And he bought up all these very small little railways that were in these little towns, and then figured out how to connect them. And those connections and rail arterials became the arterials around which Los Angeles really grew up. So they actually tore the Red Car out of Los Angeles. It doesn't exist anymore. And when they did, they fundamentally changed the way the city functions. And it's largely shaped the way that a lot of the things that you hear about Los Angeles now in terms of traffic and being multimodal and multicentric, and kind of just the way the city works, right? Like it changed the city forever. But there was one intention to begin with, right? Which is, we're going to build the city around the Red Car. And there was the strength, the vision to persist in that path long enough that it actually largely started to unfold. And then there was a shift in direction. It really, it had a tremendous impact on what was left, right? Mm-hmm. So I think the trick about this is how to be really clear about what matters the most in the future today. And that's very hard. It's a very, very hard thing to do. But looking at some of the comments, I don't think it's a question about taking those of you who have spent a long time becoming experts at this, right, digital transformation, and really having like this tremendous toolbox, and sort of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I think the question is, how do we deploy this experience and these lessons and these toolboxes in a way to create something that is for a particular organization or a particular situation really transformational. And I think it requires, I guess what I'm advocating for, a combination of thinking. It's not something that we can do either unintentionally, and in my experience, it's also not something that we can do without having a number of different perspectives at the table, that are all really working together in a very, I would say, human way or human focused way to talk about what's possible and what's not, and then plot the path forward instead of just coming in and evaluating the system and saying, okay, these are all the things that we don't like, and here's how we can improve it, and this is what we're going to do to, these are the tools and the upgrades and the changes we're going to apply to make the system better, and then everybody's going to be happy because we're going to have the same system, but it's going to function better.
Right. Yeah, it's rethinking how you define digital transformation, what your priorities are, and how you put all these pieces together. I think that's the challenge. And you talk about the city planning for Los Angeles and tying together all these railways. It's sort of like that. You've got to figure out how do you pull this all together in a way that makes sense and is cohesive and fits your strategy and enables that kind of growth that you're trying to accomplish as an organization.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that leaders have got to step up and say, okay, what do we want? And make some decisions and own those decisions, for better or worse, right? But to create some clarity around how this might work. I mean, I'm inside of sort of understanding sort of what we may or may not be going forward. One of the things that is clear to me and that we're committed to is not only being just as good as we can possibly be, being the best in the world, but also, we want to be the favorites of our customers, and we want to be an incredibly contributory citizen to Nashville, and take that really seriously. And for how many ever people we have that are on the team, whether it's 200 or 250 or 600 or whatever, right? We want these jobs to be the best jobs that people have ever had. Like, seriously, like, that they don't tell me that, but that they tell, strangers that, right? And that we think about how to build a company in a way to make that possible, right? But that's not necessarily the thought process that always happens.
Right. Well, and speaking of your team, one thing I wanted to get to, because I think this is, a relevant thing for a lot of people listening, but you have a pretty young and diverse team. I mean, from what I've seen, and I think part of it's just the entrepreneurial spirit of the company. You're in the music industry. It's a cool company. So I could see why you have a younger and perhaps a more diverse team than an average organization. But how does that impact how you approach this overall transformation and the direction you're going at NRP, or does it affect it?
Oh, absolutely. It's critical. I mean, we've worked really hard to build a team that we think is not just really capable, but a team that has a chance to be with the company for quite a long period of time, right? In my experience, it's rare to be able to have a large number of people that are working for a company have such a healthy relationship with the company that they're there for a long period of time, right? And I think that when that does happen, particularly if you do some things culturally, and if you do some things in terms of the way that you structure a leadership team and you encourage them and coach them to sort of manage their portfolio responsibilities, that you can end up with a highly dynamic, very capable group that also can have a lot of fun, like legitimately have a lot of fun at work, right? So we've been very intentional about this as well.
Yeah. And what about culture? When you think about culture within the company and the way it is now, and what you think it needs to be in the future to navigate the future of this industry and where you're at in the industry, how does culture affect your transformation, and how are you viewing culture at the moment?
Culture is everything. I mean, it literally is everything. I know a lot of people like to talk about culture. There's probably a lot of people that are sitting in my chair who, have read a bunch of books or whatever. I'm not depreciating that. It's a great way to get started, but I think it's hard. It's very difficult to be intentional about culture and then do the things that are necessary to try to foster it, right? To try to create causes and conditions where it can grow. Because culture is not something that can be intentionally constructed. It can be designed, but then it grows. It's a living thing, right? and you never get exactly what you think you're going to get, or what you thought you were going to get. That's been my experience. So I think the reality for us is this, that this is a I don't know. This is a place where I feel like language and words really don't serve us very well. But there's a story about, what is culture, right? And I say culture is everything. And I think that a lot of people think about culture as being sort of the window dressing of life, right? Or the window dressing of an experience. And I would argue that it goes much deeper than that. And so there's this story about these two little fish that were swimming out to sea for the first time. And there's a much older fish that's coming back in from the ocean into the river, and he swims up to them. It's morning time, and he looks at the two fish and says, "Hey boys, how you doing?" They say good morning, and he smiles. He says, "How's the water?" And he goes swimming on past. And the two little fish keep going out to sea, and one of them looks at the other one a few minutes later and says, "What's water?" Right? And that's culture. That it literally is everything. I think figuring out how to talk about culture, how to be able to plan and be intentional about culture, as well as all these other things that we're talking about, and then actually be able to practically make decisions and changes and structures that help support the development of culture that seems very positive, and full of potential. Like it's never been more important, and it's probably never been more difficult.
Right. And is that so? As you think about the transformation you guys are going through as a company, and as you evolve as a company, I assume then culture is something that's at top of mind for you. You said it's everything. So are you sort of deliberately defining what it is you want it to be and trying to mold it into something different than what it is now? Or maybe help us understand how are you addressing that, or what are you doing with the culture of the company?
Well, really clearly. So to begin with, there's been a clear vision about, what kind of a culture we wanted. Right. And there's some words that are really clear. We want to be highly professional, which means capable, right? It doesn't mean dressing in a particular way. Like it means professional, the way that you would think of an athlete as being professional. Somebody that can sink a shot from anywhere on the court against unbelievable odds and no time, and against incredible pressure. Like it's about capability, right? There's an attitude too that if we stick together, we can do anything, right? Like it's no big deal. We've got this. There's an attitude that it's really important to be cool. And that incorporates a lot of things. Like it means being kind, being compassionate, it means taking yourself seriously, taking the people that you're working with seriously, taking the company seriously, being responsible, being involved, right? So we've tried to encapsulate it, and that's how we started. But the truth is that we've been growing so quickly, the day-to-day experience that most people have is rather turbulent. You and I have talked about this, because back to the third stage analogy and the rocket analogy, a rocket that's attempting to get into orbit, experiences a tremendous amount of turbulence as it's breaking out of the atmosphere, right?
Right.
So do airborne objects that are crashing. And when you're inside of them, it's kind of hard to tell the difference. Like, are we really getting ready to break out of the atmosphere? Or are we about ready to crash into the ground? So there's a lot of stress. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of discomfort. And even for people that are really good in difficult situations, it's a lot to bear over extended periods of time. So I think you necessarily have to go through a period, or we're going through a period, where there's just a lot of maintenance that's going on. Just trying to take care of people, trying to listen, trying to be really responsive to situations in proactive ways, trying to do what we can to support people, right? And get far enough along through this trajectory that we can actually end up then refocusing, regrouping, and getting back to where we started, and saying, okay, now it's here where we are. This is the culture that we've wanted. How do we start proactively working on this together in a little bit less of a charged environment? But I think there has to be some accommodation made for what happens, during those periods where you push really hard.
Right. Yeah. That's super, super interesting. Well, I'm trying to cherry pick a couple questions here. One question that's maybe more of a business model question. This is from Ryan on LinkedIn. Ryan asked the question of, Ryan is a musician. So just to give you the backdrop here, I'm gonna shorten his question or just cherry pick part of his question here. But he's a musician, and he asked the question of, do you see a day where vinyl industry is capable of single or small batch print on demand solutions for artists that aren't submitting orders that are on the scale of a large record label or record company?
Yes.
Okay. Tell us about that. I think this is an interesting part of your business model. And in a way, you're sort of potentially disrupting the space as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the more we can reduce the size of the minimum run, the more titles we can make available, which is super important if you're a musician. We know that it's possible for us inside of what we do now that we could do runs that were significantly smaller than sort of what are the minimums required by most companies and most plants. And we're actively working, and there are others in the world that are actively on making sort of an ultra small run, 5 or 10, or even on demand records possible. There's lots of challenges, and not only there are technical challenges, but there's business model challenges as well. But there's a lot of effort and focus going into it. And then, on the flip side, there's things that I think that can be done to take runs that are maybe in the 100 to 300 range and make them far more available to artists that don't have, label or management support, so that the stuff can get out in the world as well. And by the way, this is a key focus that we have here and inside the group, which is how we can make more and more music available on vinyl to more people.
Interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, so I guess for organizations that are about to begin a digital transformation, what starting advice do you have? I mean, what advice would you give to someone who's just thinking about getting started on an ERP implementation or going out and finding new technology or new ways of doing business? How do you get started? I mean, what are some of the things that you've seen work for your journey, and what are some of the mistakes you've made? I mean, what would you leave us with to get started?
Yeah, I mean, number one, we tried to make it as simple as possible, right? I mean, the promise of ERP is it's this vast system that can do all these things. We tried to just really focus on what were the basics that we needed and that we were going to bring over from our parents' implementation. And I want to be clear, we literally, from a tech standpoint, we talked about this in terms of MVP, right? Like, I challenged the team to define what the MVP was, and anything that didn't contribute to that MVP was off the table for phase one. Like, we were just going to look at it, right? And that's great because it helps us focus on knowing that what we get was going to work. It helped make the implementation a little bit easier because we didn't have so much to do, and it's plenty hard as it is, even with what we've got. And it also didn't paint us into a corner because it gave us lots of room to grow if we felt that there were needs to grow without being tied into all this stuff that we didn't really understand, right? So keep it simple, or as simple and limited as possible. The second thing I would say is we were really focused on moving very quickly, and you hear about this all the time, right? But also not being too attached. And it's hard. It's hard to invest the time and resources that are necessary. You want to get it right. You don't want to make mistakes, right? But we found that the more we could hold things lightly and just keep covering whatever ground we could every day to get closer and closer and get running, was really helpful. And the third thing that I would say that we did, which has been invaluable, is that we really brought in people to specifically help facilitate our implementation, even though we didn't really know what we were getting, with a sort of a dual mission, which is, number one, help us get this thing up and running, but number two, help us go through a discovery process so that we can learn what we're actually getting. And the notion was then to plant the seeds for what comes next, right? So as small and as simple as possible, brought online as quickly as possible, where we're sort of connected to it as loosely as possible, and at the same time we're trying to develop as much information as we can about what we've got, so that we can quickly make decisions about where we want to go next.
Interesting. That's sound advice. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, and it sort of tying this all together. It goes well beyond just going out and finding a technology and figuring out a way to deploy it. I mean, there's a lot more to it, as you've talked about here today. So I think that's that's maybe the way to leave it is, let's not assume that digital transformation is dead, but let's not assume that the way we've been doing it all along is the right way or effective way either. I think we've got to sort of rethink it and look more holistically at what digital transformation is and what it means to us individually as organizations and as teams, and make sure we're looking at all those different angles.
Yeah, and I think that having you all challenge your clients to answer the question, what do they want?
Right.
So what do you want?
Yeah. What do you want to be when you grow up, and how is this going to support it?
Not what can I do for you, or what I think you should have, or, reasoning by analogy, what we've seen other clients do, but what do you want, and what's going to best serve your organization and your people, and particularly your people. That seems like a good starting point.
It's great. It's a great starting point. Yeah. I mean, you have to define that and articulate it and have a good vision before you get too far down the path of going through a transformation. Otherwise, you're just going to spend a lot of time and money and heartburn on an initiative that's not aligned with who it is you're trying to be, or what it is you're trying to be. So good. Well, I want to thank you for being here, Drake. This was a great conversation. Really appreciate having you on the show, and very enlightening too, just to hear. It's always good to hear a client's perspective too. Someone who's going through the journey as we speak, someone who's going through an industry or as part of an industry that's going through a lot of change, and you're trying to do something that's fairly disruptive in that industry. So it's I think interesting to hear that perspective for sure. So I really appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, thanks for the kind words. Great to be here. Good to see you all.
Yeah, and thank you to the audience for the great questions. I know that we didn't get to all the questions. There's a lot of them that were coming in, kind of rolling in toward the end of the conversation here. Some really good questions. Maybe we can get to that as a follow-up at some point. But thank you all for being here. And again, this live stream is something we do every Tuesday, same time, same place, on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And we will edit this discussion and add more content to it to make a full-length episode of Transformation Ground Control, which will be released a week from tomorrow. So you can hear kind of the final product, or the polished product of this conversation, along with other content with Transformation Ground Control, the episode that's released Wednesday of next week. So be sure to subscribe to the podcast if you don't already. Thank you for being here today. Hope to see you next time on the live stream at the same time, same place. Hope you all have a great week, and we will see you soon. Take care.